Elite Facts presents
Myths and Misconceptions About the Roman Empire. 8. Nero and the Fiddle. Let's start with the most common one, that Nero played the fiddle as Rome burned during the Great Fire of 64 AD. First of all, Nero wasn't even in Rome when the fire happened, but the moment he heard about it, he actually rushed home and organized a massive relief effort, which he paid for from his own pocket. He personally went to rescue victims and even opened his palace as a shelter for the homeless while arranging for food supplies to be distributed. And if this wasn't enough, he also reformed the urban plan of Rome to make sure a fire like that wouldn't happen again, making so the buildings were better spaced. Sadly, it did happen again, more than once actually. Rome has some bad luck at times. And the fiddle, well, that didn't even exist in first century Rome. But before you start thinking that he was a pretty decent fellow, Nero was also among the early persecutors of Christians, whom he used to set on fire in his gardens as a source of light, a nasty take on the Roman candle. He also blamed the Great Fire on the Christians, and just in case you still think he's a nice guy, it's worth pointing out that he killed his own mother. After several failed attempts to have her assassinated, he had her personal yacht sabotaged so that it sank with her on board.
7.
Gladiators in general. A gladiator means a swordsman, and thanks to the media, they have a lot of misconceptions. We're looking at you, gladiator. First of all, matches did not usually end with the death of a gladiator. The Roman scholar George Fiddle found out that only 19 fighters died out of 200 in the 1st century AD. Later on, however, the dying rate increased to 1 in every 3 matches. In case a fighter died, the game's sponsor would have to financially compensate the owner of the gladiator. At the end of fights, when the opponent was extremely wounded or became unarmed, the victor couldn't simply kill him without the permission of the emperor, as only the emperor had power to condemn someone to death. Killing him without permission meant the gladiator faced criminal charges. And about that famous thumbs down gesture, there's no proof that they used that gesture to signify death. More probably, it was a sideways motion or even a thumbs up. Another misconception is that gladiators were mostly forced into it, either as prisoners of war or as criminals. Well, a lot of them were, but there were a significant portion of them who volunteered, either for fame or money. If you were actually good at fighting, you could look forward to a very comfortable retirement. They were granted a villa, lands, and even a pension. And while you might think gladiatorial combat was a wholly macho thing, there are women who were gladiators also, though they were called gladiatresses, or gladiatrix in the singular. While the first documented appearance of gladiatresses appeared under the reign of Nero, it's implied in earlier documents that they existed before this. One famous account tells of how one wealthy Roman had 2 beautiful women fight to the death at his funeral. A strong condemnation against female gladiators of the Flavian and Trajanic eras can be found in the Satire 6 of Juvenal, decrying the fact female gladiators were typically from upper-class families and were seeking thrills and attention. Perhaps the bringing back of gladiatorial combat might make a lot of girls' Instagram accounts genuinely interesting. Emperor Severus banned female gladiators around 200 AD, but records show that this ban was largely ignored.
6.
Romans only wore togas. When we think of Romans, we almost always imagine men in togas, but in fact the toga was a very formal piece of clothing. To say that the Romans always wore togas would be the same as saying that the English always wear top hats and tails. Juvenal says, quote, "There are many parts of Italy, to tell the truth, in which no man puts on a toga until he is dead." The average Roman would have worn tunics, which are far easier to get on and considerably comfier.
5.
Their society was actually pretty unhygienic. This misconception comes from the fact that Romans didn't use soap, so what did they use? They used to coat themselves in perfumed olive oil and then scraped it off with a tool called a strigil. Looked like a small curved knife. Soap was an invention by the Celts of Gaul who used sheep fat to make them. Perfumed olive oil sounds much better now, doesn't it? Another reason for this misconception is that Romans used urine to wash their clothes. This sounds nasty at first, but it's worth pointing out that urine was not used fresh and was chemically treated, probably even distilled. Urine contains ammonia, which is what we use today as the main ingredient in stain removers. In movies based in ancient Rome, we see that the rich go to luxurious private baths, probably plotting and scheming with each other while the poor go unwashed. The part about the rich folks is at least true, but not the bit about the poor. Romans used to take a bath every day, and public baths for the poorer folk were extremely affordable, and children got in for free. 4. Latin. While it's true that the Romans did speak a form of Latin known as Vulgar Latin, it was quite different from the classical Latin that we generally think of them speaking. Classical Latin is what is taught at universities and posh colleges. Vulgar Latin is the language that the Romance languages like Italian, Spanish, and French, etc. developed from. Classical Latin was used as an official language only. In addition, members of the Eastern Roman Empire were speaking Greek exclusively by the 4th century, and Greek had replaced Latin as the official language.
3.
Crucifixion and death. Many think the Romans used to use crucifixion as their primary means of execution. In reality, it was usually reserved only for pirates, slaves, and enemies of the state. Roman citizens were almost never punished with this, except sometimes in the case of high treason. Non-Roman citizens, though, could still be crucified for petty crimes, but this was rare and only in extreme cases. In the case of a member of the Roman nobility being given a death sentence, there was almost an expectation and social custom that they should commit suicide before the sentence was carried out. Regarding these suicides, citizens had to apply to the Senate to ask for permission to kill themselves. If it was accepted, they got free hemlock. On the topic of Roman suicide, if a slave killed himself within 6 months of purchase, the master was entitled to a full refund from the seller. A rather grisly product guarantee, I guess. And since we're talking about death, it's worth noting that there are accounts of Roman funerals having hired jesters who would imitate the mannerisms of the recently deceased.
2.
Rome's famous marble statues weren't always monochromatic. Today, the marble sculptures left behind by the Romans look bone white, yet archaeologists have known for over a century that when these sculptures were first created, they received vibrant, multicolored paint jobs. Using a technique known as multispectral imaging, historians can identify the pigments left behind by various paints on ancient statues. With this information, they can tentatively reconstruct an original coat in all its polychromatic glory. Of course, the ancient paints were mostly washed away by time. Thus, future civilizations assumed that Rome's wonderful sculptures had always been devoid of color. By and large, Hollywood has followed suit. Virtually all movies that take place in classical Rome are anachronistically filled with drab, white statues.
1.
Julius Caesar's final words. But they probably were not et tu, Brute? On March 15th in the year of 44 BC, Julius Caesar was murdered by a group of over 60 co-conspirators, one of which was Marcus Junius Brutus, the son of the dictator's longtime mistress. The Roman historian Suetonius later wrote that, according to bystanders, Caesar's dying utterance was "Ke su teknon," which means "you too, child," in Greek. For the record, Suetonius himself was of the belief Caesar didn't say anything at all when he was slain. Neither does Greco-Roman biographer Plutarch, who made a career of writing about the lives of famous people. When you think about it, you can see how this can easily devolve into a historiographical argument where we're all forced to accept that we simply don't know what was said. Given that he was being stabbed some 60-plus times, it was probably something like, "Oh, what the hell, guys? I thought we were friends. Stop stabbing me. That really hurts. Oh!" As for the world-famous "Et tu, Brute?" that line was made up by Shakespeare. That bard really has a lot to answer for.
Don't forget to like us and subscribe for more elite facts.